I think it's very appropriate that tonight we should be talking about predators. Tracy, you were showing some footage there of cougars that are hanging around the Mossam Creek hatchery, and there was a story on global TV today about it. So it's on everybody's mind, the people that are living nearby here in Vancouver. But what I really want to talk to you about is the results that have been coming out in the last 20 to 30 years on the effects of fear from predators. And once you hear this, this is going to change how you see the world. It's going to give you a new understanding when you go outside and look at animals and the way they're behaving. If you keep this in the back of your mind, what I'm going to tell you tonight, you will start to see that actually the world is a very complex place. And there's some very interesting interactions that are going on. So the animals that I'm talking about here, what I'm really focusing in on is the concept of fear in animals. We know, for example, that predators, of course, kill their prey. And that's the direct effects of the predators. What I'm talking about here are the indirect effects from the fear, just the response of the prey to those animals. And there's a host of people, a host of scientists who have done this initial work and really opened this field up to us. One of them was Larry Dill from Simon Fraser University, and Ron Eidenberg, who's up there now, are following up with some of this work. And there's lots of other people all around the world who are looking at this. And one of the things that's really come out of it is that animals obviously have to find food to survive and to reproduce. This is a critical thing for them. They spend a good portion of their time looking for food. So birds, for example, spend about 75% of the day just looking for food. The rest of the time, the 25% is spent just preening their feathers, resting, drinking, and so on. So a lot of time is spent trying to find food. But they also have to be careful that they don't become a victim themselves. And so this game that goes on between the predators and the prey is what I want to talk about tonight. And this is the fear factor. Now you might say, of course, if you watch birds and see a predator come by, you'll see that they will respond, fly away from the predator. But you may not be aware that actually this is taking place across a whole host of animals. Some of them that are we think would be kind of simple animals. They also respond to fear. So from earthworms to clams and to birds and fish, mammals, they're all responding to fear. And if you don't believe this, have a look next time you're down on the wharf and have a look at some of the tube worms, and you'll see, when you disturb them, they respond. They go into the shells and hide. People have actually looked at this. How long do they stay? How long should they stay? And how do the responses to predators differ on how much time they spend doing this, hidden away versus feeding? And that's that whole trade-off that we're trying to do, spending the time getting the food that they need to be able to reproduce and so on, and avoiding getting eaten. So there's been all kinds of work on this, how long clams have their siphons out, how far they feed, the earthworms, what they're doing, birds, how they're responding to it. And I'll come back to some of those examples in a little while. But the key thing to this is to remember this, that all animals appear to be doing this, they appear to be responding, which makes you think kind of differently about these animals. Just how do they do this? We often think of some of the more simpler animals as just functioning, just living. They're not really responding that much to the environment. That's not true. They do really respond to the presence of predators. And then you start to think that these animals might be far more complex than we think. And they might be doing things that are far more complex than we think. And maybe we're just a little bit naive about this. So before we do that, I think it's time maybe while you're sort of pondering this whole thing about these other animals, is let's have the first question here. And I want to get an idea of whether you've ever witnessed in the wild either a bear, an eagle, or a falcon catch its prey. So you can go on here, you can see there's the question. I'd like to get a sense of this. We'll give you the answer in a few minutes, but you can answer that either yes or no. So I'm asking you if you've seen it, not on TV, but have you actually seen it take place out in the wild, how often you've seen that. So maybe we'll wait, Tracy, and sum that up, and we'll see what we get. And so I'm going to just carry on, and then we'll come back to the results of this one in just a second. So you might be asking then, how do these animals respond to fear? The thing that I'm talking about here is not putting on growing spines, having a protective shell, or any of those kinds of things that they would pass on from generation to generation. What I'm talking about is the behavior of animals, how the animal is responding. Animals have a toolkit, if you like, of ways that they can actually react. So one of them, which is quite obvious, if you go down to the seashore, you'll see that birds, for example, will form into flocks. And forming into a flock is a way of reducing the chance that you will be the one that will be picked off, because there's lots of other ones that are there. And also there's lots of eyes to keep an eye open for an incoming predator, which it gives you more time to feed. So that's one response. So schools of fish often do this. Birds often do it. Lots of animals will do this, form these flocks. That's one way to do it. Another way is, of course, to avoid the dangerous places altogether. And animals respond to this very, very quickly. They can understand this, that some places are very, very dangerous, and they should stay away from those things. All they have to do is experience a predator in there, and then you'll see a change in the behavior. I remember many years ago, going out to Bamfield when Maya Yasui was a student, and she was working on the behavior of sandpipers on one of the small beaches at Pachina Point. She noticed that the people were walking along the beach, and the shorebirds were kind of avoiding them, and she thought that the presence of the people was really dictating where the shorebirds would go. But the other interesting thing is that all the shorebirds were in the middle of the bay. They weren't going to the edge. They were just staying in the middle of the bay, and it didn't seem like it was necessarily the people that were doing this. So I said to her, they're probably responding to falcons, to the migration of merlins and peregrines. And she said, well, I haven't seen any. I've been out here all this time. There's all kinds of people. So I said, well, let's just watch and see what happens. If you watch people, you watch the way these animals are responding. The shorebirds just fly around. As the people walk by, and within 30 seconds or so, they're back on the beach feeding. They're not really afraid of people very much. They're just avoiding them, getting out of their way. Well, while we were doing that, in comes a merlin, and it puts up the flock. And I said to Mai to time this, to see how long this takes. Well, it was about half an hour before they returned to the beach. So if you compare those two behaviors of how they responded to people in maybe a 30-second response versus 30-minute response, you can see that the merlin was much bigger effect. And that's why the shorebirds were not going close to the shore, because that's where a merlin could dive in and catch them without being seen. That was very dangerous. And they had a sense of this, we think, that the shorebirds knew the middle of the bay is the safest spot. And we've done lots of other work, Ron Eidenberg, Dov Lank, and many of our students who have looked at this with other shorebirds and found the same kinds of things that go on. That dangerous places are not used as often, and the animals, the birds that go in there are ones that are really hungry and desperate. It might be a great feeding spot, but it's very dangerous. So they don't want to spend a lot of time. But the ones that are lean and fast and could do with a bit of food will take the risk and go in and try those areas. So we've seen a change in the whole distributions of these birds across the beach and also between beaches. And I'll get back to that in just a little while. Another one that animals can do, of course, is to guard against the predators. And I think one that you're probably familiar with are the muskox in the north, and how they form a ring around their young. So this is a behavioral response to the predators to keep the predator away and keep their young safe. So there's lots of ways that animals can do this. They can use this behavior to protect themselves from, or at least reduce the chance of them being picked off by the predator. And what they're finding, many of the researchers who are doing the work on this, is that the effect of the fear of these animals in the ecosystem is far bigger than the actual death of the animal. And I'll get back to that in just a minute. But while you're kind of pondering this whole thing of watching animals and seeing their different types of behavior and how that might be how they're responding to the predators, I think we have the results here. So we have, according to this, 70% of you have seen either a bear, an eagle, or a falcon catching prey in the wild. And that's great. That reflects, that most of you are getting out and spending time in the wild and have actually seen this taking place. So when you've seen that taking place, it means your eyes and ears are open, and it's really, really great to see this. So, predators are doing this all the time to their prey. So I'd like to also go on to maybe our second question, Tracy. So what I'd like to know is from you, what you, well, here we are, okay, how successful do you think they are? So it varies, of course, between predators and so on, but let's have a look at something like a falcon going after a shorebird or another small bird. How often do you think they're successful? Do they catch their prey 10% of the time? In other words, it takes them 10 attempts to get their prey. Do they get them 50% of the time or 90% of the time? So you can answer that to see what you think, how successful you think predators are at catching their prey. And we'll come back to that answer in just a minute. So what I want to do now is to take this whole concept of what these animals are doing, that across a whole array of animals, they respond to predators and they have fear, they can sense fear, and they use this behavioral response to adjust how they should behave in safe and dangerous places. And I want to take that into what that implication is in terms of ecosystems. One of the best examples of this is called the Ecological Cascades. And this is the case of where the prey respond to the predators in such a way that the whole ecosystem reacts. And the best example, one of the classic ones that's coming out now, is the study done in Yellowstone many years ago, in which the Park Service decided that they wanted to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park. Wolves have been there historically, and they felt they wanted to get the full component of all the former predators. And so a small number of wolves were taken from here, from Canada, and I think in Idaho, and moved into the park. Within a very short period of time, within a couple of years, the elk that were in the park, who had up until then had free reign of the park, all of a sudden started to change their behavior. The wolves were going after them, and the elk picked up on this very quickly, that there were now predators in the park. And as a result of that, they avoided certain areas of the park. And it didn't take very long, and the shrubbery started to change. The aspens and the willows all started to come back and started to grow in those areas because the elk were not down there browsing them. As a result of that, beaver came back to the park, and the beaver then created dams, created the ponds. And with that came insects, and came new birds into the park. It's even having effects on the runoff and the flow of the river. So the whole ecosystem reacted to this small number of wolves. And of course, the wolves were killing some of the elk, but it wasn't the effect of the actual killing that was doing it. It was the fear that the elk had of the wolves. They changed their whole behavior, and they avoided those dangerous places. And that had this ripple effect all the way through the ecosystem. Now, there is another example closer to home that Andrew Wang did when he was at UBC, and he was looking at herons down in Boundary Bay. The heron, as you know, feeds on fish that they catch by wading out onto the beach into the eelgrass beds. They stand there motionless, and they wait for small fish to come by, sea perch and blennies and so on. And they catch them. So what he did was he put up some fencing in some of the areas of the bay so the herons couldn't get in there. And then he looked at the numbers of fish in and out of the exclosure and the surrounding area. And he found very, very soon after that, the fish kind of figured this out, that this is now a safe place. And the fish started to concentrate in this area where the herons couldn't get in. Now the fish feed on small invertebrates that are on the leaves of the eelgrass. And so all of a sudden, with all the fish, all these invertebrate numbers started to go down. And from that, the epiphytic plants, the algae and some of the other epiphytic plants that line and live on the leaves of the eelgrass started to flourish. And that started to weigh down the fronds of eelgrass onto the surface of the beach. As a result of that, this effect of just excluding the herons rippled all the way through that ecosystem, from the fish to the invertebrates and all the way down to the plants. And that was measurable within just a few months of the exclusion of those predators. So I want you to think about this with large predators, any large predators like sharks or salmon or any of these large predators in the ocean or the ones on land. You can see what happens when those predators are excluded. from an environment or brought into the environment, how it can cause such a big change. This is called ecological cascades. And it's one of the reasons why we try to maintain those large mammals, those large predators in ecosystems, because they are really structurally changing the whole ecosystem if they're excluded from it. So that's one of the reasons why conservation often focuses on those big species. Okay, so let's go to the results, Tracy. Do we have results for another question here, or I have down here the results from question 2. I guess we've done that, haven't we? We went through on. No, we don't. Do we have the results for question 2 on how successful they are? Oh, there we are. 10% of the time, most people. 10%, 50% of the time, 36% of the people, and 5% if you think 90% of the time. Well, the correct answer for, at least for falcons, is about 10% of the time. They're not very successful at this, and it's obvious, you know, all these prey are responding to the predators by, like I said, forming into big flocks, keeping an eye open, not going into dangerous places, you know, staying in where it's wide open, where you can see the incoming predator. And research that has looked at this with falcons, merlins, peregrines, and so on, we find that it's around 10 to 15% success. So, you know, the predators have to spend a lot of time doing this. So it's difficult for the predator just as much as it is for the prey. And this is the game that's going on, is how they use their time and how they use these different habitats depending on what the predator is doing and what the prey are doing. So let's take that to another level here. So you've kind of got the idea that it's widespread, this idea of fear. You know that lots of animals do this. You know how they do it. I've got a sense of that. It's mostly like a behavioral response. You've learned that these effects of having the predators and the prey cascade all the way through the ecosystem. But let's have a look at it on the scale of say a hemisphere. This is what we're calling the predator landscape. And I want you to think of this, just visualize this. Imagine North America in the late summer, and most of the falcons are just finished breeding up in the Arctic. Their prey are moving south, migration is starting, songbirds moving south, shorebirds are moving south. These falcons start to follow them. As they finish breeding and they start coming down along the coast, and we start seeing the increase in falcons, usually sometime about August. That wave of falcons, we like to think of it as a tsunami, flows all the way down the continent, all the way down into Mexico and into South America. And ahead of this is where many of the shorebirds want to be. They don't want to be riding that wave of falcons. They want to be ahead of it. A few species like Dunlin do the reverse. They wait for the wave of falcons to go through, and then they follow afterward and come down to our coast. And we think that the whole migration of these birds is all timed around this. This is what we're calling this predator landscape. That if you think of it as like a quilt, that some places there's a high level of falcons, and some places there's troughs where there's very few. Well, you should be riding in the trough. You want to stay in the trough. That's the safe spot to be. And that's what we think is happening here with these, with the shorebirds and probably lots of other species. With the recovery of bald eagles and with falcons after the DDT issue, we're starting to see this whole change taking place. That we had sanctuaries set up for birds all across North America, and the birds for many, many years had a great time in those places with very few predators. Well, of course, the predators are going to gravitate to those places as their numbers increase. And that's what's happening. We're starting to get eagles and falcons and all the others going into those places. And so we're seeing the prey adjust to that as well. And so that's that game going on. Like, where would they go? And they're adjusting not only just to where they would feed on the beach, but between beaches and probably between whole beaches across the hemisphere. So all of this is taking place on a very, very large scale. And I think ecologically and evolutionary that this interaction between food and predators is probably one of the most profound discoveries that has been made in the last several decades on the ecology of animals and plants. This is a very very important point that I think we'll see more and more coming out of it. I want to also, while we're thinking about this, about these predators in the landscape, I want to take you on a little trip in your mind to the Galapagos. So the Galapagos is kind of unique in that, well, of course it's unique, but it's one of the enduring features, of course, is the tameness of the animals. And so you kind of ask yourself about this, well, why are they tame? Well, the current idea is that, they're so far offshore that land-based predators can't get there. Some of the aerial predators can. But the species that have been there for a long period of time have been free of predators. So how do they respond then to the presence of a new predator? What would they do? Well, a lot of these things that these animals are doing, these behavioral responses and things, some of them cost the animals to do this. They have a physiological response. You know what it's like when you feel fear, you feel that response in your stomach, you're feeling, the flow of adrenaline. These are all physiological costs. And species that are out on these remote islands haven't been exposed to this for a long, long time because the predators just aren't there. And if there's a cost to maintaining this, you might find that the animals may move away from that. And there has been some work on some of the iguanas out there. They think that the iguanas may not have the physiological capacity to really respond to predators very effectively because they just haven't had the predators around. So that's a very interesting kind of idea that there could be whole evolutionary effects of this on these animals where they're tame. And it makes me wonder on the Galapagos, where there's all kinds of things that might be connected to this idea of reduced fear. If you've gone to the Galapagos, you know what it's like. Those animals, some of the sea lions and the birds, they act as if you don't even exist. So this is something I think would be very interesting to explore experimentally and also just to see how that happens. We can come closer to home and actually see the effects of this close by on our Gulf Islands. The large predators have been removed, and the deer have figured this out. And of course, they are doing very well there, going into people's gardens and all over the islands, heavily browsing the vegetation and causing some real changes to the ecosystem. Some of the work that's been done up in Haida, where they've removed deer from small islands, has seen a big response where not only the flowers are coming back, but the shrubbery that is on the island started to come back. And as a result of that, all the songbirds started to come back as well. And if you're in Haida, any of you who've been there, you'll see that under the forest floor, there's very little shrubbery there. The deer have largely removed it. They were introduced to the islands in about the 20s and 30s, I think it was. So they've had that effect. No predators, they're free to roam around, and it's having this cascading ecological effect. So that's one that's even closer to home. So that's kind of explains why these animals have become tame on the Galapagos. So when there are no predators around, they may have actually jettisoned their ability to actually respond if a predator was introduced. And it's a worry about all of these areas where there's few predators around, that when a predator is introduced, what would its effect be? And it might be why many of the island fauna are in jeopardy. All right, so I just wanted to summarize a little bit here. So we've gone through the idea that lots of animals, in fact, probably all animals respond to fear in some fashion or other. That finding food and not becoming a victim is really the key to life for all of these creatures. It's across all these animals, from worms to whales. Many of you have witnessed some of the predators chasing their prey, which is good. Now you can start to think a little bit more when you're out there, and you start to see big flocks of birds and flocks of animals and schools of fish and so on. Start to think about this. Where are these animals? How are they responding? Where's the predator? What are they thinking? We also know that these predators are not highly successful. They take many attempts to try to get their prey. So that game is going on all the time, trying to stay ahead of the predator, and the predator trying to outsmart their prey. And we know that the presence of large predators maintains the ecosystem integrity. The loss of those causes a large cascading effect all the way through those ecosystems. We also know that this takes place on a very small scale right on the beach, a very small area, and also all across the hemisphere. So the presence of these and the movements of these predators and their prey are all responding to the same kind of factors, but it can be at all different scales. And the last one was, of course, the tameness of animals and the evolution of those, how those animals came about to be tame and how they respond to predators. So I think I'll leave it at that. And I think there's probably quite a few questions here. I'm going to turn it back to you, Tracy. I understand you're monitoring the questions, and I'd be happy to try to answer as many as I can.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Butler. It's so interesting to think about just the relationship that different species have in either our local environment or throughout different habitats. So a quick question from someone while you were speaking was so marine iguanas have no natural predators. I think they're just trying to confirm that's what you had said.
That's what it seems. What they did is they looked at their response on land. They made up some experimental things, and it took them a long time for the iguanas to even start to respond. And they put it down to this, that they may have no, they may not be capable of responding, or they may have to learn how to respond, but they don't respond very effectively. If you go to the Galapagos, you'll see that they do move away from people, but you can get awfully close to them.
Okay, so I see actually someone's put their hand up, but I'm gonna thank you, Joseph. I'm gonna go through some other questions that were submitted first and then get to you. So from Suzanne, she said it's an ornithology question. There used to be huge flocks of sandpipers on the beaches in Vancouver, so Spanish Banks, for example, and there seem to be none now. Haven't seen any in the area in ages. So what's happened to them?
Yeah, those are sanderlings, and there were good flocks, as you say, along Spanish Banks, Jericho Beach. They sometimes get as far around as Stanley Park, and the numbers have been falling off. June Ryder has been keeping tabs on them over the years. She lives out that way, and she can confirm that the numbers have been falling. I don't really know exactly what it is, but it could be that there's more and more people using those beaches now. These sanderlings are high Arctic nesters. They're very interesting that some of them will winter here, and I think there's even some wintering on Haida Gwaii, whereas others will go all the way down to the tip of South America. And so they've got a very wide winter distribution, but a very small localized breeding area up in the high Arctic. The little population that was here, we don't know, whether the numbers are just dying off and they're falling off, or whether they're moving. There are some still down in Boundary Bay, so along by Centennial Beach, you'll see them. Nowhere do we see big numbers, but this is the same sandpiper that when people think of a sandpiper on the beach, this is the one that you've probably seen. So if you've been out to out to Long Beach, walking along the beach in the summer, and you see them scurry down in front of the waves and then race all the way back with the wave just like chasing them. Those are the sanderlings.
Great. Okay, so another question is, we've recently seen an increase in cougar sightings in the Tri-City area, but the presence of the cougars hasn't seemed to affect the deer population around Port Moody. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
There have been more sightings, probably because you have the cameras and people are starting to see them. The news story today was one going right into the suburban areas, so they're probably moving into those. The deer, it's hard to really know whether there's been an increase in cougars or just an increase in sightings. So it's hard to really judge that. If there's just been an increase in sightings, the deer would be responding the same way. I think with the cougars now getting closer and closer to town, they're probably looking for other prey.
So, and then there's just another similar question, just saying, can you speak to the deer moving into urban areas from more remote wilderness? Is this part of the deer adjusting to the fear of predators in a more remote wilderness area? So they're coming to our urban areas. And because of that, are we going to see more and more predators moving into urban areas?
That's a good question. I suspect that they're moving into the suburbs because they realize that it's safe and there's lots of food there. There's probably predators traditionally wouldn't have been into those areas, and people, of course, are quite willing to, or they're not doing a lot to chase the deer off. And that's probably what's happening all over the Gulf Islands as well. There's people there really some people like to see the deer, and so they're probably doing well. The predators, that's a good question, whether the predators will follow them in. I guess it's what the response is. If the predators feel safe and if there's lots of deer in there, they might start to do that. That would seem like a natural response.
And then another question is, should predators be reintroduced to all areas where they used to live?
I'm not sure when you say all areas, but if you like historically where they were, I would say yes, and that would be part of the idea of restoration, to bring those predators back. What we think of, the recovery of some of the whales, they're still taking a long time to get back, but we want to make sure that they all get back to their former numbers, because it will have some sort of effect. We probably don't know exactly what it will be, and we have to be careful in terms of when we are harvesting other predators as well, and being cognizant of this, that this effect can take place. It's not just the demographics of them that they're killing some of the other prey, but the prey is responding differently as well. So it's really important to kind of start to think about this, and how would the prey respond to an increase in the presence of the predator rather than the actual killing? That's a really key question.
Okay, there's lots of questions. So what practical application of this information that you've provided tonight would be good for a working biologist to know?
Well, I think the one thing is thinking about the role of the predators, and when you see the prey responding in a certain way, to start to think of it, are they responding to the presence of these predators? It takes a little shift in the mindset to do this, and many of my colleagues have felt the same thing. They just didn't really get it, and then gradually they kind of start to see this and go, I think there's really something to it. And one thing that I always do when I do my field work, because I keep track of other things that are around, other species and things, and this is one of the reasons we figured this out with the shorebirds, is that I was keeping track of the sightings of peregrines. Like all birds, I just kept track of it. And over the 10 years of work, we noticed that the peregrine numbers were going up. And I started to think, there's more peregrines. Maybe this is having an effect on the shorebirds. And an interesting aspect of this is that we found out that the shorebirds were spending less time in these places than they were previously, because of the increase in the fear and the threat from the falcon. And as a result of that, it looked like the numbers of sandpipers was falling, but it really wasn't. So here's how it works. And imagine if you have 10 sandpipers come in each day. And so your first day, you start your count and you get 10. And if they stay just one day, you're going to have 10 each day. If they stay for 2 days, then the second day, you're going to have 10 from the previous day plus 10 more, and you'll count that as 20. But of course, you're just double counting. And the reverse happens if you put the predator in there. They spend less time. And so it looks like the numbers go down, but they don't actually. The numbers actually stay the same. And that's what we found with our sandpipers. The actual daily counts look like the numbers were going down, but when you realize that the birds were going through faster because of these falcons, the actual numbers stayed the same. We also found in Bounty Bay that with the return of eagles in November, December, after they've been feeding on salmon, they start to go after the ducks, particularly diving ducks. They're very sensitive because they're underwater. They come up and there's an eagle there. So they tend to move offshore. And same thing with western grebes and some of the other divers. And over time, through the season, you'll see these birds move offshore. And on the Coastal Water Bird Survey, you can't see them, so they don't get counted. And so there's this issue that, have the birds just moved offshore where you can't see them, or have they actually gone down? So this is one of these things of, don't necessarily think that the numbers have gone down. Have a look and just see, have they changed their distributions? So it's important to keep these things in mind.
So that's interesting with the numbers going down in certain species and not knowing where they've moved or not. So someone has talking, and I think they must be talking about Port Moody because I certainly see a lot. So there seems to be an excessive number of squirrels recently, despite our coyotes and barn owls and eagles and even, cougars and bobcats that we have in the area. So despite local forests having these coyotes and barn owls and eagles, so why is that?
It's probably a combination of things. Maybe people are feeding them. They're going to bird feeders, and they're still probably spreading the squirrel that we have here. The gray squirrel is an introduced species, and they were confined into Stanley Park for a long, long time, but they've got out and they're spreading all around the Lower Mainland, and the numbers may be still just increasing because they're moving into new habitat. Coyotes will probably have quite an effect. The coyotes are affecting a lot of the feral cats, of course, and anybody who is a cat owner knows this, that, you got to really watch it when you have a cat and it's going outside. You've got to be really careful because there's, coyotes are around looking for things to eat. And there actually is a study on this where they were looking at changes in bird numbers in California. And they thought it might have been habitat related and found out it was that the coyotes were taking all of the small predators, and the songbirds were responding to all of that. So there were more songbirds around simply because the coyotes were removing their prey or their predators. Sorry.
Got it. Okay. And so another question, and there's hopefully you're okay to take more questions because
I do this all night.
Lots of interest. So would agriculture for cougar disappearances from the prairies? Because I guess historically there were cougars in the prairies.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not really sure whether that. I just don't know the situation on the prairies in terms of the historical numbers of cougars. There have been some big changes and things to, of course, all those big mammals that were out there. There's a fascinating paper written a few years ago looking at the distribution of these large mammals in response to the distribution of people. And it was one during the Lewis and Clark expedition. They noticed some areas there were lots of game around and some others where there were not. And it had to do with the people, native people, their presence, because of course we're predators as well. And so it has an effect on the distributions. We often forget that, when we're walking around, a lot of animals consider us a predator, and it's obvious, they fly away from you and avoid you, but we don't really think about what that bigger effect is of our presence. Walking along on trails and things, we do have an effect. I'm not saying you should change any of this, but just be aware of it, that you are viewed as a predator by an awful lot of species, and they will adjust their behavior to that. You've probably seen that yourself, that if the animals learn that you're not going to do anything to them, they become more tame and will not fly quite as readily as if they see you as a threat.
Okay, so another question, thank you. What about the heron colony in Port Moody? What impact might it have, good or bad, on the shoreline? And can there be too many? And then there's another question that I'll combine with this. So what are the predators of the great blue heron?
Mm-hmm. The number of predators in the inlet here has remained fairly constant over time. The colonies move around in small numbers here and there, and it's probably in response to the suitable foraging habitat for them. They feed on shorelines and eelgrass and where there is some, and off wharves and so on. And there aren't a lot of really great feeding areas for them, so the numbers are relatively small. I think if we were able to get the eelgrass bed, the historical one, back into Port Moody, you might see more, because where there's good eelgrass, there's usually lots of herons. So the numbers haven't really changed too much. In terms of the predators, the main one is the bald eagle. Lots of others will take them, raccoons and ravens and so on, but the eagle is the main one. We got quite concerned many years ago. Ross Dennisland was a student of ours. He had a look at the nesting success of herons, and he found there was widespread disturbance caused by these eagles, and the number of young that were being produced really dropped off. And it's one of the reasons that it was listed as a species of special concern by Kasiwik, because it looked like the numbers may not even be able to maintain themselves. Well, it ended up that the herons had a trick up their sleeve. You've probably seen the story of this. It was in Hackeye magazine a little while ago, as well as it's in the scientific literature as well. Some of the herons have figured out that a few of the eagles are busy finding food elsewhere, and it's really easy for them to find food, and they're not really interested in the herons at all, or very little. And so instead, the eagles are spending a lot of time chasing all the other eagles away from their nest. And these herons have figured this out, that this is a great place to nest. The best one to see is just down off the BC ferry terminal there in Tawasin. You just pull off at the base of the terminal. There's a big colony of 300 to 400 herons. All of those herons have figured this out, that eagle there is busy just feeding on the beach. It occasionally takes a heron, but it goes down on the beach most of the time. And all the herons have nested with it. And we know that this is the case because that nest has moved and the herons have moved with it. And in one of the other cases, there's an eagle nest in which the eagles failed. And when that happened, all the eagles moved in and really did a number on the herons. The following year, when the eagles were doing fine, they chased all the other eagles away, and the herons also did well. So there's lots of them that are starting to do that. Not all of them. You've got the one in Port Moody that's not doing this. Some of the small colonies like that seem to take that bigger risk and try to nest in other locations. So if the eagle is busy somewhere else, you'll see herons gravitate around them.
Okay, so from Jane, a question from Jane Shoemaker. So there used to be beautiful grouse in the Fraser Valley. Is it human beings shooting them that it's resulted in their rarely being seen nowadays?
Yeah, those are ruffed grouse that you're talking about, I think. Historically, we had them all around here too, all around the city. The numbers have fallen off. They largely live in aspen forest. They seem to really like that. And it could be hunting, but I suspect it's mostly to do with the change in habitat, just with all the development and, with cats and coyotes and all the predators. They just aren't doing very well here. They're okay elsewhere, but not around here. And it's a real special treat to see them. I think John Reynolds saw some down in at Minnetonka just last year.
Okay, thank you. And then from Roy, there's a question. I understand the fear factor also has been observed on the Gulf Islands between raccoons and intertidal species. And there was a change in raccoon foraging behavior when a researcher played dog barking calls. So I wonder if you're aware of any research on this concept with insects.
Sorry, what was the last bit?
Roy's wondering if you're aware of the same research on this concept of playing sounds with insects.
I'm not aware. I know the research on the raccoons. We actually discovered one of those. We were out on our boat one night, Rod and I, and we went onto one of the islands. We heard this strange sound in the forest. Wondered what the heck this was. It was a tape recorder playing the songs. It was part of the experiment that was going on. But I'm not aware of that, no, with insects.
Okay, and then this question someone's asked in our question and in our chat, so I'll give it to you. So one day I saw a dead salmon on the creek side by Hyde Creek. So I don't know what killed it, but it was untouched. It didn't have claw marks, teeth marks, or weapon marks. Can you explain?
Oh boy, I don't know what that is. No, if there's no marks whatsoever. The only thing I can think of is that it might have been attempting to dig a red or something like that, and maybe just flipped out onto the side of the beach and couldn't get back. I really don't know. I'll have to turn that over.
Yeah, maybe it jumped. Maybe it was spawning and it jumped out. Who knows?
That could be too. Maybe jumping up a stream and kind of misjudged it. Yeah, don't know.
Maybe. Difference in water. Maybe it was rainier the day before. Who knows? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So next one, how do you feel about predators? So grizzlies moving on to Vancouver Island, where historically they've not had a presence, and would you support their removal?
I think some of this stuff is, we should probably leave it to nature to, if they get there. First of all, I'd like to really know that they weren't there historically. I'm not that. I know the story of the grizzlies getting to the island, but I'm not aware. Not a grizzly biologist, so I'm not sure of the the history behind it all. But my general feeling is, we should try to leave things alone and let nature take its course here. Where we step in, of course, is when there's human health and safety that's involved. But generally, we try to leave that. And it would be an interesting thing to see what would happen, whether the grizzlies can hang on and whether they would survive. But I think I'd have to turn that over to the grizzly biologist, somebody who actually knows the issue better than me.
Maybe a future talk for our Mossam Creek talks with a grizzly biologist. That would be certainly interesting.
Okay, great.
So,
yeah.
Another question, and maybe we'll just take 3 more questions because I don't want you to fall over from, these are all great questions. So can you speak to the potential reestablishment of the stellar sea lion cull on the BC coast and what impact it would have on the ecosystems of their local waters?
I think you're talking about these California sea lions have come up. They've been here historically, and the numbers of sea lions and things have fluctuated a little bit. Of course, all of this will have this effect. So I think the bigger effect here is that the presence of seals, as we know, the numbers of seals recovered and really grew along the coast. Transient killer whales have responded to that. And so the same kind of thing is going to go on between the transient killer whales and the seals, and probably with the sea lions, the same kind of thing. That the sea lions, have to come off the rocks to feed, and where they feed and how far they go will be all based on that fear of getting caught by a transient killer whale. And so with the presence and the growing number of transient killer whales, we could see a change in the movement of the sea lions, and also maybe a change in the prey. So one of the ideas that we're just starting to explore is, do the transient killer whales actually do this to the seals? And as a predator, do they keep them closer to the shore? And what do the fish do then? Do they respond to this? So these are all these ecological effects, and it just, you realize, just how complex this is. It's not just a one step, there's multiple steps, and it takes a lot of time to kind of figure all that out, figure out what's taking place and trying to predict what's going to happen. But they are complex ecosystems, and that's why I love it.
And so a question from Jen is, what predator has killed the most humans, not counting other humans?
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, going back to the beginning of time?
I don't know, or even a location maybe. I mean, I will leave it to you to narrow that down.
Oh boy, yeah, that would be
No.
that would be a tough one. Because different parts of the world, there's of course different predators that have taken people. I'd have to really think about that. That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll put it on Jen to research. She can get back to us. We can post it to everybody. Yeah. Perhaps, oh, there we go. I was going to say mosquitoes. Like, mosquitoes have killed more people, in my opinion. So I feel like it's going to be something small. We're thinking big, like a lion or something.
Yeah, mosquito is a parasite, not a predator.
So here's and just a couple more questions. So listening to CBC radio program recently about dodo birds, apparently they were easily killed by people because they had no natural predators and so no fear factor. So I would have thought the lack of fear factor in a normal ecosystem would be rare. Is that true?
Yeah, generally, if there's predators around, the animals will respond to them. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as you can see, as I was trying to say here, is that when the predators are removed, such as on the Gulf Islands, the prey respond differently, and they go into places that they wouldn't have gone in the past. So if you have an island where you have no predators for eons, of course, you're going to see these changes.
And then I'll just do this last question. So if cougars have no natural predators, could we ever have a problem like that has occurred in the state of Oregon? So they have an increased population, which resulted in teenagers, so teenage cougars, young juveniles, acting more aggressively as they compete for food.
I think you should ask your previous speaker about cougars, about that whole response. In a general sense, you're probably going to see more interactions with cougars because they will be looking for their prey and coming closer to the city, and if there's prey there that they can get, they probably will go in there. But I think it's best to really speak to somebody who's a specialist on this with cougars. That it's not my field whatsoever.
Got it. I think people are curious about some of the larger predators that we have, the big species of bears and grizzly bears and coyotes and cougars that we have in our urban environment. So last question, just curious, as fish returns differ from year to year, how do the predators such as eagles adapt during the slow return years?
That's a really fascinating question because we do know what happens on this story, and this is really intriguing. So as some of you probably know, the eagles here on the south coast, they nest through the summer, and by about the 1st of August, they disappear. It's just a few eagles around. Most of them are gone, and they move up the coast to the spawning streams where the salmon are starting to come in and spawn. And if you go to those streams, you'll see hundreds, maybe even thousands of eagles. So most of them are busy doing that. So that creates that window of time from August through till maybe October, early November, when eagles are absent from here. And that's the time that many ducks come down and go through a molt, lose their feathers and things, so they're flightless because it's relatively safe, we think. We think it's not just coincidental. And then when they come back to the shore in late winter, the eagles would like to feed on ducks. And what they find is that the peregrine falcons that I was telling you about that arrive in August and September also like to feed on ducks, particularly the big female peregrines. They'll go out and catch the ducks until the eagles return, and then the eagles steal the ducks off the peregrines, and the peregrine shifts to feeding on the dunlin. Now, the return of the eagles is really dictated by the strength of the salmon run. So if it's a good run, the eagles will spend more time on the river. That means the falcons will hunt ducks longer, and the dunlin get away with not being preyed on by peregrines. In the converse, of course, is if it's a poor year, the eagles come back early, steal the ducks off the peregrines, and the peregrines turn to the dunlin early. So the strength of the salmon run on our salmon streams, and some of them up the coast, is going to dictate the effects on shorebirds, the dunlin, through this long sort of chain of effects.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rob. What I'm going to do is I'm trying to figure out which of our guests is Kevin, because I have two choices. So I'm going to, where did he go? Maybe he's changed his name, because I know that nope. On 1 second. Let's see if that. So.
Yeah, that worked.
That's him.
Now you got me.
There we go. Okay, Kevin, here you go. It says you're Alice, but we know you're Kevin Ryan. So I'll hand things off to you.
Thank you. And Rob, thank you very much. This was so interesting. Right from the get-go, when I heard the topic of your discussion, fear factor, I knew it was going to be interesting, and you certainly didn't disappoint. A couple of things that I picked up when you mentioned that 70% of their time spent looking for food. That must be exhausting. Pretty amazing that they spend that much time looking for food. The other thing is that you mentioned several times, and it's so important, is that the ecological cascading impact and the changes, and what I kept thinking about when you talked about that was how people have such an impact on so many things in the wild, and we've got to be aware of everything that we do usually has an impact on the wildlife and the ecology. So just on behalf of Mawson Creek and Vimes, I just want to thank you, Rob. It was a fascinating talk and great questions and lots of good answers. I'm sure lots of people learned a lot from you, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And I just want to mention too that the foundation that I work for, I'm president of the Pacific Wildlife Foundation, is in our 40th year. And as part of this, what we're doing is giving talks such as this. We're hoping that if the health safety things are allowed, that in November in Port Moody, we can hold an event and bring out a whole bunch of speakers to talk about things like this. And we'll keep them short and sweet. And hopefully many of you will be able to attend.
I think that's awesome. And certainly we're practicing our Zoom webinar capabilities on the off chance, right? But we're all hopeful that we can meet again in person, because I think there's a lot to be learned online, but also with these valuable connections. So thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to end everything now.